ag and urban, is partnering together to deal with scarcity when those times come. So what are those components? Well, we've heard a lot introduced, and so now we're moving on to the what can we do. So I'm going to hand it over to Abby, and Abby's going to talk through, so what does this suite of options really look like? Some of which you've already heard, some of which she's going to speak to more. And then she's going to transition us into this exercise that we're going to do. Please stay for it. It's a lot of fun.
Great, thanks. Okay, thank you. Better? Okay, so I'm going to zoom ahead, in part for the sake of time, because we do want to not keep you here late and have you do the exercise. So I'm not going to talk about that recharge piece. We're talking about the demand management, or how do we reduce what comes out of the ground piece, picking up from where I was before. What we really want is groundwater savings. We have existing actions. We have reservoirs. We have CSIP. We have things that are already done. And there are projects in the works. And really what we're talking about are, okay, where are we going from here as a community? What are those options for future actions? In another sense, it's, yes, we have an existing infrastructure. And sure, there are Sigma goals. But where we started the conversation was, we have a groundwater basin that has these uncertainties. We have these fluctuations, right, to deal with. I talked a lot about floods and droughts, but there are other types of uncertainties that could happen, or unavoidable challenges. So in addition to drought, we have growth. We don't know what's going to happen in the future as far as what growth means in either agriculture or for the residential sector, municipal use. Changes in demand pattern. We've seen changes in crops that have changed demand patterns before. There are also crops that use a lot of water, that there's nothing saying what direction we move to, or that individual private entities move to in the future. We don't want to admit it, but there could be infrastructure failures. What happens if that occurs, right? Regulatory changes. Sigma changed the game on groundwater, right? We also don't know what's coming down the line. I mean, we have an idea of some of them, but there could be more in the future. So how do we plan for water with these potential uncertainties and unavoidable challenges? And that's part of this conversation and part of thinking through what makes sense in the Valley. Okay, so I'm going to talk through, I think, about a dozen different demand management actions, essentially, call them all actions. This is trying to put a framework around it. So it's not just, you're not walking out with like, oh my gosh, there's this big laundry list of everything we could do, but trying to organize it a bit in your mind to think about the types of different things that could be done. And hopefully it'll give you the tools to later engage in, okay, what do we want as a community? What's appropriate for us? And how does it be designed appropriately, those financial mechanisms, equity aspects of it. And later there will be GSA discussions through the sub-basin committees about what's appropriate over here or over there, or this compared to some of the other options, right? So this is just building the foundation. We're not deciding anything here. I'm not telling you one is better or right or wrong. We do break them down in a couple different ways, just to help you wrap your head around it. Is it a temporary action that you can put in place when you need it, just in a drought or just for a short period? Or is it permanent? Once you put it in place, it's there for the future. Reliance of benefits. Do you have the same benefits year after year? Or does it have variable benefits? For example, does it depend on rainfall, or does it depend on how many individual households adopt whatever we're talking about? Voluntary versus obligatory. Is it a program or an action where you're saying, please put in a low flush toilet, please do something, and then those that want to can, but it's on their own volition to do that? Or is it obligatory? Is that something that's required by a regulation or a fee or something like that? There are certain things that don't really work well voluntarily. We can't say, please pay an extra $100 a month for water. Anybody who would like to pay an extra, please go right ahead. It doesn't work that way. Nobody's going to pay that. And then variable cost. Now, I'm going to start simplifying things. This is a complicated beast. There's a cost to implement, and even before then, a cost to plan it out. But there's often an overhead cost or a cost to frame up some sort of action. And then there's often a maintenance cost over time to continue that. I'm going to kind of simplify those. There's often some gray area in between, so some things have a higher overhead and just a little bit to maintain it, or more to maintain it over time. The bigger, probably trickier item is who bears that cost. Is it a cost to an agency to put it in place? Is it the economic cost for individuals to either put in place that thing or that they would bear the cost borne if something goes forward. And a lot of times these can be designed so they're slightly more one or another. There's different financial mechanisms that you can use to plan these out, and that's part of that planning phase. In the slides, we do broadly characterize things as high, medium, or low cost. That's a big arm waving, like generally to help you wrap your head around it compared to the other things. Generally, this is lower cost or higher cost, but it's not, I'm not sorting out exactly what it is. That's part of the design of things. And I'm also not sorting out exactly who bears that cost. That's part of an equity, a political piece, a policy piece. Okay. So a couple caveats. This is not an exhaustive list. However, if you see big holes of other things we should consider, by all means, flag them for us. I mentioned we generally are ranking them as far as high, medium, low, cost, and benefit. They can be implemented separately or together, and there are a few that work well together, and I'll highlight those. And then a couple are variations of the others. Okay, so the first, I'll skim through this pretty quickly because we had speakers talking about urban conservation. This is a big one. Water savings come from individuals who invest in new technologies or practices. These tend to be permanent. You put in your low flush toilet and then you have those water savings in the future as long as that toilet is in place. They tend to be voluntary. Very rarely is somebody coming around and say, you must adopt this, you must put in place this technology. But that means that it depends on how many people actually go forward and do it, which in the design of the program, is it advertising on the radio? Is it workshops? Is it somebody coming in and helping you install something? Are there financial incentives? You get different participation rates depending on those things. Tends to be low cost, although when you get into financial incentives, that's a bigger cost. And then you get recurring benefits. I'm going to move fairly quickly for the sake of time. Decentralized residential water capture. Also, the water savings come from individuals adopting practices. Perrette talked a little bit about this. So this would be like rain barrels, for example, that you put them in place, you can capture rain and then use it to irrigate. It's permanent as long as you have those rain barrels or those technologies. Voluntary, again, low cost for an agency as long as they're, until you get into financial incentives, and you get the benefits year after year. One thing Perrette mentioned is that it may or may not be appropriate in certain places, especially for rain barrels, because we have this wet season and dry season, right? My rain barrel in DC filled up, a couple times a month, so it was all I used to irrigate my garden for a large part. Here, once you end the rainy season, you might not see rain for several months, and then so you're not getting that same benefit necessarily. And of course, we have fluctuations across the valley. Promote best agricultural practices. So these are water savings that come from individual growers adopting technologies and practices. Norm talked extensively about what has already been done. There's already been huge savings. These are permanent, tend to be voluntary. Nobody's making them do it. Low cost as far as the agency part, typically, and recurring benefits. Now the questions, and this applies to the previous ones as well, is, okay, what percentage of growers, what percentage of folks have adopted these already, and to what extent? What percentage haven't? And that gives you an idea of how much else could be done, right? Or could they extend what they're doing? Could they do more of it, for example? To get an understanding of, okay, is it really worthwhile? If you have a 95% adoption rate already, well, there's only 5% less to get. And so if you're not getting a whole lot out of that, is it worth the time and effort to do? So on the residential side, we have big, water systems that have spread a lot of different practices. We also have areas like El Toro or Prunedale that have a lot of small water systems that haven't had the same sort of efficiency programs, right? So it might vary depending on where you are. And same thing for agriculture as well. Where have things been adopted and where could they be adopted? And what would provide that hook to actually get to adoption? What would they be responsive to? Limit place of use. So this is one that may or may not be appropriate here, but it is a tool that can be used. It's when water savings come from limiting how far away water can be used. This is typically done like on a county scale. There's some examples in Central Valley, for example, where water is taken and it's transported and used elsewhere. And so by limiting place of use, especially if it is to the detriment of the groundwater basin or the place where the water comes from, you're limiting the overall water being used. It's temporary or permanent, depending on how it's designed. It is obligatory. It is a regulation that would be put in place or a policy put in place. Low to medium cost, you would need some sort of enforcement on it, but you get that benefit in the future. We don't have necessarily the same sort of water system, so I'm not sure that's appropriate here, but it is a sort of regulatory mechanism that is a tool. Provide water use data. This one is a growing area that's being adopted quite widely. Water savings come from individuals assessing their individual water use and increasing efficiency. So it's a tool to understand and help people understand how much water they're using, when they're using it. Do they have leaks? Where are those inefficiencies? How could they, tighten their own water budget? We see precision agriculture kind of going that direction. And so there are examples where agencies provide those data platforms that then help individuals figure out how to improve their own efficiencies. These tend to be permanent. You have that data, it's put in place, people can use it. It is voluntary to use. We're not making anybody use the data. Medium cost to implement and maintain. Generally, you do have to pay for gathering that data, and typically it's real time, or you update the data over time as well. So it's not a one-time snapshot. And then likely recurring benefits year after year. Once you identify how to stop those leaks, you've stopped them in the future, and hopefully more incremental changes too. Fallowing options. Scary word. A lot of these things are scary. I recognize that. Like I said, we're not making decisions. We're just trying to think through what's a broader range of things that could be implemented. So if you're not familiar, this is when agricultural land is fallowed. Groundwater then is not pumped for irrigation. Land must still be managed, so you can't just leave a field and just walk away from it, right? You still have to manage it in some way, so there may be a slight water use, but not to the same extent as when it was irrigating a full crop. So here we have a couple different options, and actually probably more than I've got here, but there are different ways where this could kind of fit into the existing system a bit. So one would be to delay crop replacement. So for crops that you have for several years, say vineyards, for example, when you are turning over a crop, rather than plant it right away, leave a little period of fallowing. So it's like a temporary fallowing before you put in that next crop. This could be a temporary or permanent policy, voluntary typically, low cost to public, medium cost to individual growers. So fallowing, I'm going to end with one of the financial mechanisms. This is a big one of who bears the cost, how is that cost shared? It could be in some ways implemented and the grower bears the full cost, but typically we're talking about a shared groundwater basin, and so there will be some sort of equity piece to that as well. So there's a lot of considerations in the design of something like this. Variable and likely low benefit every year. So this one, because it's not a huge, well, I guess depending on how much time is fallowed, this is just kind of edging that direction to try to help get some water savings in a place where realistically you want to work with the cycle of the crops, which are across multiple years. Now, if you have something like vegetable crops where you have multiple cycles per year, something like rotational fallowing might be a better option. So these come from rotating. You get water savings by rotating the fields that you use. So maybe one of the fields is left fallow while you're growing on other fields. The next cycle, you would grow on that field and leave another one fallow, or not even that extreme that just everybody, in the program has one of the cycles throughout the year that they're fallowing a portion of their fields, right? You can scale these up or scale them down. This tends to be permanent, obligatory, or part of some sort of program, voluntary program that incentivizes it. Low cost to public, medium cost to individual growers, but that is, again, how you do that cost sharing. And then reoccurring benefit as long as you have that program. Now, fallow bank is one example of a financial mechanism that could be paired with those previous options. So to make it such that the cost is not solely borne on the grower that is fallowing, water saving, you could have multiple, either whatever group of people, putting in money to some sort of bank or some sort of pot of funds that then is doled out to those growers that are actually implementing the program, right? So the water savings come from resting different fields from fallowing on a rotating basis or through delay in crop replacement, but it's funded through that bank. So this could be temporary or permanent, tends to be voluntary on the part of those who are doing the fallowing. Often they're set up and you're not just voluntarily giving money to the bank, but there's some sort of cost sharing where everybody's putting in for it. Medium cost to public, individual growers, again, depending on how it's done, and variable benefits. Then the end of the fallowing spectrum, I would say, is repurposing or retiring agricultural land. So this is taking an irrigated plot and fully taking it out of production forever in the future. These water savings come from permanently stopping that irrigation or greatly reducing it. And these tend to be things where there's either are pieces of land that just aren't very productive anyways, or that you could get other benefits from doing something else there. Putting in a recreational path, having a riparian corridor, having an area where you get more recharge or some environmental benefit. Right now there's a multi-benefit land repurposing program, long name, which is trying to look at, okay, how can we figure out what makes sense, and who willing landowners would be as well. It does require purchasing that property typically. There may be options for an easement or something, but usually it's a fairly hefty cost to actually purchase that land. But then it's not a 1 or 2 year program, right? You get that in perpetuity. So permanent, voluntary, high cost, but you get that recurring benefit. 2 more. Tiered extraction fee. This is when water savings come from some economic incentive to reduce water. So similar to electricity bills, does anybody try to conserve electricity just to get their bill to be lower? Anybody? Yeah. So water typically has been cheap, right? Especially groundwater. There hasn't been a fee for that other than drilling your well, certain other fees. And so this is trying to say, okay, we're going to edge in the direction of trying to help people conserve and help them want to conserve by putting a price on it. Now, one way to build in an equity element of that is to have a tiered structure. So everybody gets either a base allotment or you're the first whatever amount of yours that is pretty cheap per acre foot, pretty cheap per the amount of water. But as you become less efficient and you use more, the cost per water goes up, right? And you become even less efficient, you get this higher tier where you pay more for it. This could be done without any overall cap. It could be done also with some sort of cap or trying to look at what the overall water usage we want. But regardless of how it's designed, these are trying to have an economic incentive to be able to help people conserve and help people want to conserve. Can be permanent or temporary. It's really hard to do on a temporary basis, but it's possible. Obligatory, so nobody's going to want to pay more. It has to be some set structure. High cost for managing, so you have to, there's going to be lots of little tiny situations that are sorted through for who pays how much and who's not paying their bills and is there enforcement. So it does require management, but you typically do get benefits year after year. And finally, the end of the spectrum, the scariest, compulsory rationing. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about stopping all water use, right? It is important for drinking water. It's important for agriculture. We realize that. But there can be situations where having strict limits could be helpful for reducing water use. Did anybody get through that 2015 drought and they told you not to water your lawn or only to water it once a week? That sound familiar? That's a type of compulsory rationing, right? And if you watered it once a week, it was like, okay, a little bit, but don't go gangbusters and water every single day, right? So there are ways to, we're not talking about stopping all water use, but trying to, in certain ways and in a fair way, ratchet down the overall water use. It can be permanent or temporary. It is obligatory, right? You're not asking people, you are telling them don't water your lawns on those days. High cost for managing often needs some sort of enforcement or a high penalty if people don't do it, but you do see benefits from that. Okay, so we're going to move in a moment into an exercise. Now.